Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you coming out. This lecture series I'm relatively new here, and so I know that this is a long-running lecture series, so I'm proud to be a part of it and part of organizing this one. So it's sponsored by Labatt, who their children are here in honor of them sponsoring this distinguished lecture series. And so I was telling our speaker in my second week here, Marta Diffin comes in my office and she's like, "You get to pick the lecture series." And I said, "Well, what's the theme?" And she's like, "It's kind of wide ranging." And so as I learned more about Schreiner and more about some of our amazing programs, just one day kind of the light bulb went over my head and I was like, I know this guy who flies planes and did ROTC, and then he was a history professor or history teacher and ended up being a principal, and we have all those programs here. So I invited Commander Kennington to come and give this lecture series today. So I'll read his bio for you. Commander David Kennington is a veteran of 28 years of service as a naval aviator, including 3 combat tours, 2 in the skies above Iraq in Operation Southern Watch, and 1 on the ground with Special Operations Forces during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. David Kennington is also a veteran of many years in the public school system, both as an educator and a high school principal. After nearly a decade as an administrator, Mr. Kennington felt the call to return to the classroom, and in 2024, he was pleased to join the staff of Odyssey High School in Colorado Springs, where he lives now. There he serves as a co-instructor for the university courses, through the National Education Equity Lab, as well as teaching classes in the United States history and world religions. I've called David my friend for, we did the math, I'm not going to say the number, over 40 years, and I hope that you're inspired by his stories and by his perspectives as much as I am. So please welcome to the Labatt Distinguished Lecturer, Commander David Kennington.
All right, the first trick is to get the PowerPoint click working. I think I've got it. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. It is a true honor and a pleasure to be here in President Park. Dr. Crowhart, Mr. and Mrs. Labatt, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be back in the Hill Country here. It's great to see a place like Schreiner University thriving the way that it is. I had the pleasure of touring the campus today, meeting with staff, students, faculty, and the energy and enthusiasm on this campus is infectious. And I'll share some stories about students that I got to meet today. And it is a neat thing to be able to see a place like Schreiner thriving right here in the Hill Country of Texas. As Dr. Crowhart said, I've been asked to share my experiences across what are perhaps an unexpectedly diverse set of career fields, one namely as a pilot and the other as an educator in the public school system. And it was the melding of those 2 careers which allowed me to experience some truly remarkable events, of which I'll share a few tonight. As I was preparing my remarks and getting to know Schreiner University, I ran across your "Who Are We?" statement. And as you know, it says, at Schreiner University, students enter with hope and leave with achievement. And I have to say, I like that. In fact, that's not a bad motto for your life. If you can enter each day with achievement, and you can enter each day with hope and leave it with achievement, and you can string days and weeks and months and even years together like that, you may be able to become the best version of yourself, and perhaps even experience some remarkable events. And I certainly found that true in my own life, because you see, we live in extraordinary times and exceptional times. And this maverick university here in the Hill Country of Texas seems to offer an impressive selection of on-ramps to take your hope and forge it into achievement. And I have to say, students, congratulations. You have chosen your university well. And speaking of students, I had the pleasure today of meeting several members of this impressive student body, and I'd like to share just 2 anecdotes of what I learned today about Schreiner University from the fine young men and women who attend here. I had a chance to meet Cadet Chase Durr. He's in your Schreiner Institute. Comes from an Army family, he told me, and dreams of joining the Army Rangers one day and being a part of that community of our Special Operations Forces. They are an elite group, and he absolutely believes that Schreiner University can help him achieve that. And I asked him, what is one of your major takeaways here at Schreiner? And he said, I need to have an initiative to go after my education. He's absolutely right. I also met Maddie Medina today. She is an environmental biology major, and she told me she's very excited about this deer density project that she was able to do, and she used thermal imaging from drones to track the density of these deer and their migration patterns, and she's very excited about the opportunity to do that here at Schreiner University. She wants to go into the veterinary program and into that field, and I think she's going to be really prepared for doing that. She feels that way after attending here at Schreiner. So these students have certainly entered this university with hope, and they fully intend to leave with achievement. It was really a pleasure to meet them. So for the other students who may be in the audience here tonight, see we have a few here with whom I have not yet had the pleasure to meet. Let me emphasize a point I trust you already know. You belong to the most consequential and powerful nation in the history of the world. And that's not hyperbole, nor is that exaggeration. And so you are uniquely positioned to achieve great things in this world. And Bill could tell Dad, we also live in Texas. This is a land of big dreams, and having had the pleasure to be stationed here in the Lone Star State, I can say with some experience, right, that this is the prime time of your life to live large in this university, and what I saw today seems very poised to help you achieve. So tonight, for everyone here, I hope to provide a few inspirational stories, which I believe illustrate that one of the paths to achievement can be found when you find a way to merge the mindsets of the warrior and of the scholar. And so allow me to briefly preface my remarks by providing a little bit more context and background to my time in the cockpit and my days in the classroom. So as Dr. Labatt mentioned, I had the pleasure of attending University of Colorado. Bill Buffs, you may be familiar with one of our football coaches out there who likes to make a big splash. Your provost and I were roommates, and upon graduation I had the unique honor and privilege to be commissioned as a naval officer. My primary role for the Navy was serving as a pilot. And in that role, I have experienced the unbelievable acceleration of hundreds of catapult launches off of Nimitz and Kennedy-class carriers, and then the thrill and danger of flying those planes back onto those same pitching decks. And one of my first catapult launches was in one of those fleets, the F-14 Tomcat. You know, those antique, venerable planes you only see in museums now, or movies, if you've seen a few of those. But I tell you what, when you put the throttles forward at F-14 Tomcat, it goes in full afterburner, firing forward faster than a bullet. It is an exhilarating experience that Hollywood captures just a little bit. Now, as the aviator, I was deployed twice to flight combat stories over Iraq and Operation Southern Watch. And on those tours, my primary platform was the E-2C Hawk that had that fire-breathing beast that you see right there. And I'll tell you some more about flying that plane in harm's way. I also had somber duty of being airborne just days after the terrible events on 9/11, flying combat air patrol in defense of our homeland in what became known as Operation Noble Eagle. And my third and final combat tour came when I accepted orders to the storied Navy SEALs and deployed to Afghanistan in support of special operations on the ground with a new and unmanned aerial system, drones in our civilian vernacular. And so I have heard the terrible sound of incoming enemy rocket fire. And I learned how to distinguish the sound of an AK-47 made by the Soviets from the higher pitch rattle of an M4 assault rifle. And such are those consequences of a career served at the edge of the American Empire and her forever wars. So if you'll permit me to make an analogy from an ancient Greek perspective, I've learned how to achieve among the Spartans. However, if you'd ask me what I do for a living, I would proudly tell you that I am a teacher. And after departing active duty with the Navy, I stepped into the classroom, and I've been an educator now for nearly a quarter of a century. High school history is my area of expertise, which simply means I get to tell cool stories all day long to people who are required to listen to me. If my intrepid students want to actually earn a good grade and need to demonstrate that they've actually learned something from my instruction, we'll talk more about learning and the value of that in a moment. And as an educator, I've had the honor of co-teaching a Georgetown University course. I've been a coach. I've been in school leadership, most recently as a high school principal, and now in the last years of my career, I've chosen to conclude my tour of duty in education back in the classroom, returning to be a teacher. So in short, and again from an ancient Greek perspective, one might say I spent a co-equal time among my brethren in Athens. And so it was here at the intersection of my career in the military and career in education, the melding of those two disparate worlds of the Spartans and the Athenians, the warriors and the scholars, where I discovered a component of achievement that had been previously occluded for me, and which I hope to expand upon tonight. But first, since I'm here at Schreiner University, I thought I might include a more modern example than the Spartans and the Athenians, and I don't think I'm going too far afield here to suggest that perhaps even Captain Charles Schreiner, founder of this institution, would ascribe to this point of view about warriors and scholars. To understand, he was a Texas Ranger, right, part of the most effective warrior class here in our society, and he also believed that the people required, and young people required, a scholarly education in order to be truly liberated and free. And so perhaps Captain Schreiner saw the value of forming scholars and warriors right here in the hill country of Texas. So let me provide maybe a more personal example to have perhaps refine this point. My great-grandfather was an industrial engineer and a metallurgist. And for a while, he worked for Henry Ford and ran the River Rouge factory, if you're familiar with the steel industry. I see some nodding heads back there. That's in Dearborn, Michigan. And so as a child, my grandfather, the Michigan fan out there, okay, outstanding. So as a child, my grandfather told me this about steel. He said it's an alloy. And it's made from iron infused with carbon. And he said separately, these elements, iron ore and carbon, are not nearly as powerful. But when they are forged together, when the iron atoms infused with the carbon atoms, you get steel. That is far stronger, more malleable, more useful than those two component parts. So many years ago, as I prepared to leave the Navy and enter the classroom, I asked myself some difficult questions. Right? Can a person integrate the mindset of the scholar and the warrior? Can one be both an academic and a combatant? And is there a value in achieving metaphorically this dual citizenship in both Athens and Sparta? And I believe there is. And the experience of doing that created an alloy in me that I found to be stronger, more malleable, and allowing accomplishments I would not have been able to accomplish otherwise. And that is my pivot point to the second part of your school's motto, in which I hope to address the remainder of my remarks, which is to leave with achievement. And I'll share tonight with you three stories, sagas, which I think may illustrate my point about scholars and warriors. And if you will permit this salty veteran sailor to perhaps make a few suggestions, then you may find some inspiration to take flight, to launch with hope into the great adventure and achievement that waits all of us just beyond that horizon. So I would also like to frame this bit by saying, in this great country of ours, ordinary people like me, like your provost, can experience some really extraordinary things. So perhaps, as I tell these stories, you might imagine yourself in these situations. What would you have done when faced with these challenges? So the first story about the show will address the power of the simple act of instruction, of the dignity and value of teaching, and more importantly, of learning, which is the essence of scholarship. Because it was a civilian teacher and his chalk talk lesson that saved my life, my crew, and my aircraft. So to fully understand this story, let me take you to the western Atlantic, north of Puerto Rico, in a military operating area that also happens to reside over the Puerto Rican Trench, which extends to a depth of 29,000 feet. It is the deepest water in the entire Atlantic Ocean. Not many people know that. And this vast oceanic area, it gives rise to some of the heaviest swells and worst weather that I have ever seen on this planet. And so it has earned the superstitious moniker of being a part of the infamous Bermuda Triangle. And so there, in this spot, my air wing, and he was operating off the USS Truman. At that time, it was the newest Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. And I was airborne in the long-range surveillance aircraft I showed you earlier, the E-2 Hawkeye, eyes and ears of the fleet. But it was years before this particular flight, I had been sitting in a classroom in Norfolk, Virginia, the home of the E-2 Fleet Replacement Squadron. It is the training ground for those who hope to one day land a fleet aircraft on a carrier. And I was attending ground school, so our aviation folks, right, know what I'm talking about there. And that was where civilian instructors taught us systems necessary to safely land these planes and go in harm's way. So do we have any members of our Shriner aviation program out here? Yeah, all right, very good. Good to see you, good sir. So you know, right, that your success as a pilot begins with systems knowledge and the time on the ground, memorizing those intricacies which can save your life in the air. And so for me, on one of those numberless ground school days in Norfolk, one of my instructors, D.K. Miller, I remember this guy's name, he invited me up to the chalkboard. As students, we had chalkboards back in those days. And that board spanned the entire length of the classroom. And while the rest of my classmates looked on, I started on the left side of that chalkboard, and I began drawing every circuit, every breaker, every generator, every bus tie in that entire $80 million aircraft. And for the better part of an hour, while I went through multiple pieces of chalk constructing my diagram, DK lectured. And he said, 75% of your emergencies in a Hawkeye will involve the electrical systems. You must learn that system in its entirety. And then when I finished, DK began to instruct us in the intricacies of that electrical system. Things that were buried in the NATOS manual, that big book of systems that every naval aircraft has. And at one point, DK taught us about this little innocuous switch way back behind the pilot's seat. And he said, when you flip that switch, it will bring floodlights on into your cockpit. In the unlikely event that you ever have a complete power failure, you can at least see your instruments. So I filed that information in the sort of nice to know category versus need to know, but ironically it was that little switch that made all the difference in the world 24 months later when I was steering my trusty Hawkeye back to the USS Truman. So let's go back to the Western Atlantic. I was flying a late afternoon mission. My co-pilot and I had been observing a massive range of cumulonimbus clouds that were building up over the Puerto Rican Trench that day. They were 40,000 feet high, higher than my plane could fly, and they cast these long, forbidding shadows out over the ocean beneath us. And if you know anything about thunderstorms, they have enormous columns of air that are about the size of freight trains, and they are going up and down inside that thunderstorm at thousands of feet per minute, and they power an environmental energy of enormous proportions, and they can slap a plane straight into the ocean, especially if it's hit at low altitude. So in short, it was dangerous business to test our fate with those storms. But on this day, for my crew and I, there was no choice. Every divert field up and down the Antilles chain was socked in. We were low on fuel. The Atlantic was to our back, the storms to our front. Somewhere on the other side was the aircraft carrier. So I did what I had to do, and I steered my tiny speck of an aircraft toward that massive thunderstorm, and we disappeared into its grim slate gray walls, dropping through the intense blackness inside that immense squall line. As we descended, the storm began to rage against us, knocking against the fuselage with such force that landing checklists had to be secured to our knee boards to prevent them from flying across the interior. Nevertheless, inside the cockpit, a calm, red-lighted cocoon existed. You see, I had spent hundreds of hours flying right in that area, right in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle, right? So I was well-versed in that kind of meteorological chaos. So as the instrument gauge clicked down toward the carrier, I geared my mind for the landing. And during night recoveries on the ship, there are no visual cues outside the aircraft until you see that carrier. I'm going to show you an actual picture of what a carrier looks like at night. That is an actual picture right there. So my ability to fly the plane until I saw that was entirely committed to the red backlit instruments in the cockpit. You see, flying by the seat of your pants is impossible. Your inner ear will lie to you. It'll tell you you're climbing, when you're descending, turning, when you're straight and level. And countless aircraft crashes have occurred throughout the history of aviation. Pilots did not trust their instruments, instead trusted their inner ear. So having logged many foul weather approaches to arrested landings, or controlled crashes as we like to call the traps on the aircraft carrier, I knew to trust those instruments implicitly. They were the red umbilical cord that connected me to the real world right outside the Hawkeye. And even the color of the lights served the purpose. The red spectrum does not degrade your night vision. And that was key because we were going to be flying in at minimums. We might break out about 200 feet above that aircraft carrier, about a quarter of a mile, and at 130 knots, that would give us about 15 seconds for me to acquire that ship and make a play for the deck. So now as my instruments showed that I was about 10 miles from the back end of that Truman, I glanced out the windscreen and sure enough, no sign of the boat. And as we closed on that still invisible ship, there was an audible click and everything went black. And that was the only warning that I got. It was like someone had flipped off a light switch. We had a complete and utter power failure. My red light cocoon inside the aircraft was suddenly and completely obliterated. We were blind. Now I heard the engines surge, so I knew we had not become a glider. We were still a powered aircraft, even though I couldn't see anything. But this was not supposed to be possible. Right? We had backup systems for our backup systems. So how could this be possible? Well, there I was. My lifeline to the instruments severed. We were low on altitude, even lower on options, in the middle of a lethal thunderstorm. If we could not troubleshoot a solution quickly, that plane would roll off in a direction that I couldn't sense, and we would cartwheel into the ocean, which was only about 1,000 feet beneath us. D.K. Miller, my ground school instructor, was right. A majority of your major emergencies in Hawkeye would be electrical. And that's when this chalk talk lesson flashed out of my memory. And so I reached way back behind my pilot seat, somehow found that switch and clicked it on, and white floodlights flooded the cockpit. But what I saw did not return my sense of control. Every navigational needle was spinning. My gyros were upside down with an off flag, and the radio was dead. It was a Bermuda Triangle moment. Fortunately, the designers of the Hawkeye, in their wisdom, had put pneumatic gauges into the Hawkeye, driven by air pressures. Our pilots out here probably know what I'm talking about there. One of those was the altimeter that was showing that I was in a steady descent toward the ocean. So I very gingerly took that yoke and began to arrest that descent, literally with my fingertips, and that they cannot induce any kind of uncommanded roll, and that altimeter stabilized. So what had happened in the barrage of turbulence inside that storm, some wire had wiggled loose inside the maze of the electrical wires and had knocked out all of our power. Well, then there was another one of those ominous clicks. The power came back on. And I had no idea how long we had to have power. The gyros righted themselves, the radio popped back to life, and thankfully, at that moment, the carrier appears out of the gloom, like the Flying Dutchman. Called the ball, LSO responded, and soon we were flashing over the deck of the Truman and smashing down one of those controlled crashes. And the tail hook snatched up that heavy arresting gear pendant, and we were jerked to a halt. I tell you, never had a trap felt so good. So shortly, my trusty Hawkeye was chalked and chained to that pitching deck, and my crew and I were trudging toward the island, the massive superstructure of the carrier that juts 10 stories above the flight deck. And by that time, I'd regained my composure, right? Composure expected of a pilot who had just cheated death and defied gravity. But I knew the truth. It had been a close call. And had it not been for the intricate systems knowledge taught to me by my instructor, in which I had learned, no amount of airmanship or crew coordination would have been enough to save us that night. So if you want to leave each day with achievement, then invest in learning, students, and listen to those scholars who are around you. Because to live a life of scholarship will demand much of you. But scholarship will always positively impact your life eventually. And if you choose to join Shriner's aviation program, which I got to see a chance to see today, it's an amazing program. We wanted to see one of the planes, but they were already in the air already. It's just remarkable what's going on over there. Well, if you join that program, pay attention to ground school, learn your systems knowledge well, because the chance that you will face a life-threatening situation in the air is about 100%. Well, that leads us to our second story, and the simple truth that if we want to leave with achievement, that perhaps we need to do more than just develop a love of learning, we must allow scholarship to influence us, to integrate and to alloy the scholar into who we are. So if I may illustrate this, back in the waters north of Puerto Rico, after trapping aboard the Truman, I yanked open the armored steel hatch on the exterior of that ship and dropped down the ladder well into that vessel. And while the Truman surged through the deep water swells off Puerto Rico, I was actually planning for a very different future than the one the Navy was offering me. You see, I was at the end of my sea duty, and it was time for my next set of orders. My commanding officer wanted me to stay in the Navy and arranged a slot for me to attend test pilot school. Right? That's a dream shot for every pilot. But I had decided to go a different route, and I had accepted orders to an assignment on shore that would allow me to earn a master's degree and a teaching certificate, a decision that would embark me in an intentional trajectory away from those pulse-pounding hazards in my squadron and into civilian life and toward my long-term goal of being an educator. And it was also toward another goal, which was spending more time with these guys right here, my wife and amazing children. That was my senior prom date. I married my high school sweetheart, pretty lucky guy. There, she deserves a medal for being with me for 32 years. And my 4 amazing kids. And I've been watching my kids grow up in videos while I was at sea, so I wanted to change that trajectory. Now, at this point in our story, in the fall of 1999, as I pursued my calling into education, I could not have conceived of the hazards and challenges which would thrust themselves in our country just 2 years later on September 11th, 2001. And those terrorist attacks, of course, would inaugurate a 20-year global war on terror, the brutal demands of which would eventually call me back to active duty from civilian life and slingshot me out of the classroom and into a bloody ground war in a far-off landlocked country. But that part of the story was still many years away on the horizon. For me, shortly after 9/11, I walked away from 10 years flying planes in the Navy to pursue my calling into education. And it would be a radical change. And I was preparing for that as best I could. But what I was not prepared for, but what I readily welcomed was how the academic world and being an educator would change me. The Spartan was joining the Athenians, and I would never be the same again. I was eventually hired to teach in the International Baccalaureate program, students at a large 2,000-person high school. And if you're familiar at all with the IB program, you know students complete a rigorous 6-year program starting in middle school. Culminates in international exams their senior year, and our IB program was intensely demanding on students and also on their instructors. Scores were publicized, and if your students didn't meet certain standards and performance, then you might not be invited back to the school. But I loved the challenge, and I loved the opportunities to mentor my young scholars, as I call them. And over the years, most of my young scholars would go on to college and universities, some to military academies, some to the Ivy League. One young man named Sterling got a full-ride scholarship to Harvard. These young people were going out to change the world. What I didn't realize was how the world of academia was going to change me. And it was not just my perspective that was changing, but also my habits of mind. My worldview were being alloyed, much like the steel-making lessons that my grandfather had taught me as a child. And for me, the component parts of being a warrior and learning how to become a scholar were being integrated. And this integration was showing up in all places on my personality test. Are you familiar with the Myers-Briggs temperament indicator? It's one of the common personality tests out there. It's a psychometric framework which maintains that our personality, right, predisposes us to certain patterns of thinking and thus decisions. So, for instance, people with the intuitive category, what Myers-Briggs uses as the N, right there, if you're familiar with that, they look for patterns and meanings in information. Intuitives read between the lines, they think abstractly and are more innovative and future-focused. Scholars, among others, arguably, excel here as intuitive. Consider ancient Athens, right? That's where Plato founded his academy. Now, in our modern era, I ran across a 2022 study by the Harvard Undergraduate Open Data Project, and it found that at Harvard, that its students' most common personality category was intuitive. Isn't that interesting? And the study explained it this way. It says, the intuitive Harvard undergraduates prefer imagining the future and thinking about a problem first as opposed to sensing individuals, a different category, who prefer straightforward reality and working with facts. That dichotomy looks like this. So those with the sensing category do that. So let me elaborate on that contrast. According to Myers-Briggs, sensing people use their senses to gather information. They're focused on facts, practical ideas, step-by-step procedures, and are present-oriented. The Spartans arguably excelled at that. Right, the Spartans, they were the most effective ground military force in Greece for centuries. Why would they change something that was working so well? Now, interestingly, and in contrast to the Harvard undergraduates, research shows that the modern U.S. military sensing is the most common temperament. Here it is, they're Harvard, right? And the military. Now, I'm not trying to place value judgment on either side of that, of those personality types, not at all. In fact, what I think it does is it speaks to the complementary nature of that. Right? Let's consider Greece. When the Spartans and the Athenians were allied, they were able to defeat the superpower of the day. Anybody out there seen 300 and maybe 300? Okay, right? That's about Thermopylae, right? And then the sequel to that was Salamis. So that was the naval victory. Go Navy. Right? They really defeated the Persians. But when the Spartans and Athenians were in conflict, it led to a bloody civil war that eventually weakened Greece so much that the Macedons were able to conquer them. That's under Philip, the father of Alexander. So, joining these things, having a complementary nature between our warriors and scholars, we can see historically that was very powerful. And for me personally, as I spent 8 years in academia, my personality began to shift from sensing to intuitive. And my horizons were really expanding in a new direction. Again, not better or worse, but just different. And the warrior perhaps was integrating with the scholar. And I'm about to tell you a story of the dramatic impact of that integration, that alloy, when I made the abrupt decision in 2010, after 8 years as an educator, to rejoin active duty and deploy to combat in Afghanistan with these guys right there. Now, transitioning from the classroom back to a combat zone, it's a fairly complicated story I won't share tonight, but essentially it was this. The Navy SEALs were deploying into Afghanistan for the first time a ship-based drone called the Scan Eagle. If you've seen the movie Captain Phillips, Scan Eagle makes a guest appearance there. And the SEALs were looking for aviators to come fly these planes because they didn't want to put one of their trigger-pulling snake eaters behind the console, so they were looking for aviators to do that. And that just sounded an interesting way for me to make an impact with one of my old skill sets. So I applied, I was accepted, and 2 weeks later I had orders to Afghanistan. Fitted in my shirt, a silk tie for Kevlar body armor, and an assault rifle, and departed academia for Afghanistan. And I was leading this team right there, holding one of those Scan Eagles there. I'm in the yellow Navy shirt at that point. I mentioned the rapidity of this transition to emphasize the fact that while I was back among the Spartans, the extent to which over the previous 8 years I had become a scholar, an Athenian, well, that guy was coming with me to combat now. And that reality would surface and result in an explosive showdown with my comrades in Arms 31 Combat Patrol. Now, in an interesting twist, while my orders were to the Navy SEALs, my crew and I were transferred to an Army Special Forces team. You see, at that time, 15 years ago, drones were not very common on the battlefield, and pretty much everybody wanted a piece of what we were offering, and there was a food fight inside SOCOM, and well, Afghanistan was a big Army show. The Army won that argument. And so I ended up with the Green Berets. And the Green Berets go by the acronym ODA, which stands for Operational Detachment Alpha. They all have numerical designations. The guys I was with were from first group, so 13, 14 of the guys that I spent. So if you're able to follow all that, by the way, my wife said, don't bore them with acronyms and whatever you do, so I'll try to limit those. But basically, if you follow all that, I had to learn how to speak Army really fast. And what's interesting about that, when I arrived in country with the ODA, with Green Beret guys, you also have to pass what they call the sniff test, which is essentially a canine reference to they kind of give you a sniff and see whether you're able to run with their pack or not. But apparently my Army brothers ended up being pretty satisfied with the job my crew did for them, because as my farewell gift, they decided to deliver that Green Beret style, which was bearing tanks of diesel fuel wrapped in det cord, and then they stood in front of it and detonated and blew it up, right? And then they all took a picture, signed it, and gave it to me at my farewell party. And I was close by when they blew that up, and I literally drove off the road. It was that loud. They are pretty important. And I tell you what, it remains the best end of tour award that I ever achieved. Now, in training my crew, those guys down there, they were all Navy reservists mobilized to come out. Some of them were civilians. Part of my leadership philosophy for this group was based on the words of the commanding general of the entire Afghan theater at that time, Stanley McChrystal, kind of infamous for what happened over there. But he said something that was interesting to me. He wanted to make sure everyone in the military understood his intent to use force carefully, judiciously. You see, in Afghanistan, they endured a lot of conquest before we got there, the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was brutal. They made a lot of orphans. They made a lot of widows. And there were generational hatred for the Soviet Union. In fact, some of the Afghans still mistook us for them. And so what General McChrystal said was, the shot you don't fire can be as advantageous as the one we do. And I know we have some young men here in the Shriner Military Institute, and that's great advice. We have incredible power in the United States. Using that judiciously is so important. So that guidance in my command philosophy are put to the test on one mission where my crew and I were providing Overwatch and quick reaction force. Here's finally the second acronym, other than QRF. So that's a quick reaction force. So let me show you a picture of a quick reaction force in Afghanistan. That's not the one I'm going to talk about, but it is a picture that's in the same vicinity of where we were. So essentially, the QRF, a quick reaction force, is a heavily armed element of tactical vehicles which leaves the wire and use the compound that heads in harm's way in response to an emergent threat. That's the quick reaction. And on this day, before dawn, a quick reaction force departed Firebase Thomas. That was a little outpost we called home in response to a group of insurgents being sheltered by the Labatt tribe. Insurgents, Taliban, we weren't sure which. But this tribe was known as the Kuchi tribe, and they had established a tent-city north of our outpost, which was the perfect mobile location to launch guerrilla raids against our tiny Firebase. So the QRF commander asked me to launch a Scan Eagle, provide reconnaissance in the ahead of his trucks. The reasons for that request was because that patrol also had with them an Apache helicopter, which was the most deadliest attack helicopter we had in theater. So Scan Eagle going out ahead of the trucks, scanning for threats. We actually could provide a certain amount of identification and targeting information, and allow that QRF commander who was in those trucks to call in the Apache. Unfortunately, without my airborne eye, that QRF would be blind, it would be reactive, and forced to wait until the enemy attacked before they could respond to such restricting rules of engagement. Now, the trucks that went out that day were not equipped to carry a Scan Eagle with them, so I couldn't ride with them. We controlled from the back, so we had to control it from my operations tent. So you can see that there. I'm standing on a recovery platform taking that picture. Scan Eagle's about to leave the rail there. But behind that, you can see those tents. That's where we would control that. Now, the challenge was communicating with the truck, so they sent one of their sergeants, QRF sergeant, to sit right beside me and look at the relay video from my Scan Eagle, and then he would communicate with the trucks and tell them what they were seeing. So there I was. The sun was coming up in western Afghanistan, a lethal assault force bearing down on a suspected insurgent outpost. My remotely piloted drone was out in front, its electro-optical eye sweeping for threats and beaming the images directly back to my operations tent. We were on the leading edge of the global war on terror. Now, the Scan Eagle controller that day, you want to look around at some of these young people sitting right here. He was 21 years old. He was a college student. We had mobilized him right off his safe campus, and we deposited him in a hot war zone. He was a petty officer in the Navy Reserves, and we selected him to come out to us. But he learned his job well, and he was one of my best controllers. And as this young man remotely steered the bird closer to the tent city, he patterned his camera work exactly how I had taught him to do so. A layered search pattern with no blind spot, no ambush locations, no IED emplacements on the cover. So with two figures, moved out of that tent city toward the road that QRF was going to take. To get there, he picked them up immediately. And he knew without a word what I wanted to see. And so he selected a button on his control stick that zeroed in the Scan Eagle's camera aperture on that possible threat. And I looked over at that QRF sergeant sitting next to me. I pointed at my screen. He knew exactly what that was. The video was green, black clarity, a combination of low light and slang range, but the video was clear enough to see the two figures had knelt beside a culvert and started digging. It was a classic textbook IED emplacement. IED, if you're not familiar, provides explosive devices, a small, deadly charge, and they love to put it under the culverts. They would shove that under there, and then the trucks drove over, and they would trigger that, and carry enough explosive charge to a 40,000-ton vehicle and toss it like a Tonka toy. At that point in Afghanistan, 75% of our casualties in the war were IEDs. These were deadly, ineffective weapons. So the Army Sergeant immediately began communicating to the QRF commander in one of those trucks. And I could only hear one side of it, but in the end, the sergeant looked at me and said, "We're going to bring in the Apache." Now what that meant was we had just fulfilled a very complicated flow chart of the multiple rules of engagement that resulted in an authorized use of deadly force. Apache had been given the green light. Back in my operations tent, there was a palpable energy in the air. We had been hit by incoming rocket fire. We had lost friends, we had lost comrades, and now we had a chance to strike back. You see, the warriors were gearing their mind for action. But for me, the scenario that began to unfold just looked different. Something wasn't right. Despite meeting the rules of engagement, I started to see inconsistencies. You see, it was winter. It had been raining the entire night. Intel told us the Afghans were terribly resourced. Very unlikely they would have been out there in the freezing rain, just waiting for a QRF to show up. So these nuances were turning over in my mind. When the scan eagle swooped in closer to our target, the video began to become more clear, and the two individuals digging into the culvert began to take shape. And that's when things began to fall out of place. Namely, the two figures did not look like military-aged males. They appeared to me to be young. And they hadn't sprinted to the culvert like someone who was in a hurry to bury explosives and get away alive. They looked more to me like two of my adolescent students, dragging their feet, begrudgingly, going out to clean the gutters after a rainstorm. And they were about to be wiped out by an assault helicopter. And I tell you, once the gears of war are in motion, they're very, very difficult to stop. But I had the power to do so. I was a senior officer in the U.S. military. I had the authority, responsibility, and accountability to make the right decision. If I told my college-age operator to remove his camera from the target, it would alter the rules of engagement in such a way that the Apache would not be able to engage. Those Afghans would live. But if I did so, if I ordered the camera to pull off target, the reality was an IED might be in place under the road and detonated, killing my comrades in the QRF. Think about that. What would you do in that situation? Would you risk the lives of your colleagues, your friends, to save the lives of two people you've never met and never would? Or would you press on, ensuring your friends lived, even if it cost the lives of others? For me, surrounded by warriors gearing to the fight, I was just seeing something completely different. Perhaps the scholar was speaking to me internally in ways the warrior could not. And I did not have a second to deliberate. In a moment, the Apache was going to elevate over that low ridge north of Tent City and descend with lethal intensity on the two figures digging in the culvert, in full compliance with our rules of engagement. So I stood up, walked over to my college-age controller, and told him to take the camera off target. He looked up at me briefly to make sure I knew what I was doing, and I was serious, which I did. And then that young man obeyed his orders. And he slew the camera away from the two Afghans who were now walking back to the tent. And it was like a bolt of electricity went through that ops tent. The Army Sergeant jumped to his feet and onto his cell phone, dialing the QRF commander directly. The only portion of the commander's response that I could make out was the blistering profanity directed at that sergeant. If you're not an aficionado in military vulgarity, well, let me tell you, the F word can be used as a noun, an adverb, an adjective. If you're creative, a preposition. I think I heard all of those that afternoon. And I'd never witnessed an Army sergeant's face blanch before, but it went white, and after he hung up, he looked at me and he said, "We're going to go around and finish." Now, can you imagine if that QRF commander knew what my day job was, right? There was a high school history teacher and a college student who was calling off an Apache helicopter to redirect his QRF. He might have had a few prepositions for me. Well, at that moment, the Apache assault helicopter did burst onto our screen, sweeping in a menacing circle over the top of those tents, but its weapons would remain silent that morning. And I looked at my operator and said, "Snap a picture." and he clicked a button to save the photo to our hard drive. Would you like to see what that photo looks like? There it is, right there. So you can see the Apache in the lower part of that picture, the tents up to the right. I've kept a copy all these years. See, at that time, I wanted a JPEG for my after-action report, which I would write later that day and submit to my chain of command. I was anticipating taking a lot of heat for my decision, and I considered titling the report, "The Shot We Did Not Fire," because we didn't that day. Shortly, our camera showed the QRS tactical vehicles. They were surrounding that Kuchi village. You can see right there. Soldiers dismounted and began to search every one of the tents. In the coming days, I would later learn that not one explosive device was found in that tent city. When we searched that culvert, there was no evidence of an IED. The only weapon of war that did turn up was a rusty old AK-47, and I tell you what, in Afghanistan, a Kalashnikov, that's about as prolific as, well, handguns in Texas. So no one was surprised to find that. So how did my crew leave with achievement that day? Well, there were 2 young Afghans alive. Who would not have been? Otherwise. A family whose follow-on generations did not have 2 more reasons to hate Americans. And the only thing my Army comrades had to endure was a bumpy ride through the Afghan countryside. So if you want to leave with achievement, pursue scholarship and then allow the scholar to influence your life. Let it balance the warrior instinct that is within all of us. Well, that brings us to our final story for you. I've shared with you 2 examples of how the scholar perhaps informed and integrated with the warrior. And now I'll seek to shift that paradigm and briefly share with you a situation where I suggest the warrior informed the scholar. After returning from my deployment to Afghanistan, I accepted a discharge from active duty, stepped back into the same classroom, teaching IB students again. However, shortly after returning, the deputy superintendent came to me and said, "I'd really like you to spearhead this program called Troops to Principals." You may have heard of Troops to Teachers program. So I went through the first class, helped my district get that Troops to Principals program online. And shortly after that, I was hired as an assistant principal, and I spent the next roughly decade in school leadership and as a high school principal. You saw the picture of me with the splat, right? This pilot principal day. Great times. Well, in many of the schools in which I worked, I directly supported or was placed in charge of school security, which was, to say the least, one of the most complicated and challenging assignments for a school leader because of the nature of the threats facing our academic institutions today. Do we have any security officers, retired law enforcement here in the office? Well, they might find particular interest in what I'm about to talk about today, because the incidents of school and campus shootings are a terrible plague and a blight upon our great nation. The proclivity and propensity of these events is staggering, as we saw in shocking detail, right, just a few weeks ago on the university, in the Utah Valley University campus. Our public schools and our universities have both been such frequent sites for violence that I always challenged my staff to embrace the mindset of, it's not going to be if we're going to face an active shooting. You need to think it's going to be when. You see, when we're faced with grim truths, we must respond with resolute determination. That determination allows us to steel ourselves for eventual action, to prepare for our worst day with courage. Perhaps we won't need that. Perhaps our worst day won't come, and then we've only wasted a few hours girding our hearts and our minds for that action. So I encourage my staff this way, I said, prepare for an active threat on our campus as if it will happen. You see, if we do that, it allows us to think like shepherds, like protectors, like sentinels. In other words, it allows us to embrace that warrior mindset. And in October of 2021, at my school, that mindset was put to the test when we became a tragic member of the growing list of schools to face an active shooter. And I will preface this with the gratitude and humility that not a single student or staff member was injured on that terrible day. But it was a day where we came perilously close. The first indication we received of the threat was a call by our school resource officer, SRO, who was a Colorado Springs police officer, who was off campus responding to the very threat that was unknowingly inbound to our school. And then he provided a description of a suspect who had exchanged gunfire with officers, and our SRO said, "You should take necessary precautions," and I knew exactly what that meant. So I walked out of my office to the front desk secretary and instructed her to secure the building And for us, that meant announcing that we were restricting all exterior movement on the campus. And then she pressed a button that was right underneath her desk. And that electronically locked all the exterior doors, including the double-door guest entrance there at our school. Now, within a few moments of that action, I saw a person fitting the description provided by the police coming towards our guest entrance. To my shock and surprise, when we pulled on that main exterior door, the lock failed, the door opened, and he entered our school. To my relief, when he grabbed on that second security door, the lock held. And then he turned and he faced me, and all that separated us was a thin plexiglass shield. What I did not know at the time, but what I would learn later, was this man had murdered his girlfriend in Arizona. And he jumped on a bus that had deposited in downtown Colorado Springs, where he attempted to carjack a car, got in a gunfight with police, fled them on foot, and was now inside our building. In short, a cold-blooded and armed murderer standing inches away. The hero that day, the warrior scholar of the moment, was the secretary. While I observed from behind her, she courageously told this killer to leave. He locked eyes with her, and he turned around and walked right out our front doors. I've never seen anything like that before or since. It was like something out of Star Wars, right? The Jedi mind trick, right? These are not the droids you're looking for. Okay, and off he goes. It was amazing. I'm here to, if you don't believe secretaries have enormous power, you may want to re-examine their presuppositions. I've seen them in person. Well, the darker portion of that story, as this killer walked away, I could see a heavy object concealed in the front pocket of his sweatpants. And as I was to learn, it was a semi-automatic handgun that he used to murder a woman in a firefight with police. And as that active shooter reached the end of our parking lot, several police cruisers converged and a firefight erupted. And bullets began to fly through our school building. Now, by that time, by the grace of our good Lord, we were in lockdown, which meant that staff and students were on the floor, away from doors and windows, and not one person was struck by a stray bullet. I would later learn, observing the crime scene, that investigators placed small fluorescent stickers, bullet holes. I didn't know that when detectives come out to do that, so they can easily be identified. Sides of our school were riddled with bullet holes. It was a miracle that none of our students and staff were injured that day. But there was one person who met their maker that day, and that was the active shooter, who was neutralized by our brave men and women in law enforcement. So here's my point. Bravery is not limited to those in law enforcement or the military. Courage is not a quality of the experienced or the old. I've seen incredible courage from our teenage sailors on the decks of aircraft carriers. And I've seen courage from dozens of those working in education, including our secretaries. And my friends, we saw courage right here in this intrepid community this very summer. And when I was preparing my remarks, I inquired of your provost if he thought it would be appropriate to reference the devastating floods which struck this county just a few short months ago, a disaster which might have impacted almost everyone, if not everyone in this audience. Dr. Philhart believed that it was appropriate to address the courage of those who faced those floods. And I do so with great admiration and somber tribute to those who lost their lives in that effort. And like many in our nation, I watched in sad shock and violence of those floodwaters, but I also stood in awe by the remarkable courage from everyday Texans who displayed for our country the true meaning of bravery. And I understand your campus served as a way station and supply depot for those first responders working the flood. And Dr. Philhart sent me the donation link, which my wife and I were pleased to provide support. And I don't wish to recount a specific story, although I heard many. I imagine those memories may still be raw. But as you know, this community, they were teenagers, younger than those students in this audience, who rose to the occasion and saved the lives of the young who were younger than them. It was amazing. You know, people my age, you tend to say they worry about the next generations. I don't. I see the best of them walk through the halls of my school every single day. And after the stories of heroism from the young people of Kerrville County, my friends, we have a great generation of young people right here who are poised to lead us into the next century. And I had the privilege of talking to some of this generation on campus today. They're sitting among us here in this lecture hall. And I believe they know this lesson already. If you want to lead with achievement and live with courage, it's To conclude my remarks, I'd like to end where I began. Take you once more into the cockpit of a naval aircraft. This time, imagine yourself with me. It's a dawn patrol. We're getting ready to launch in the North Atlantic, something I've done on hundreds of missions. We're going to be the airborne sentry solo, protecting the entire battle group. And as you do your pre-flight walk around, you feel the heavy rise of the flight deck as the carrier crests a massive waves that are rolling out of the darkness and breaking against the hull of this Leviathan ship. Then as you strap into the cockpit with dawn coming up over the eastern horizon, you feel the carrier heel to starboard. This massive vessel is turning into the wind to launch one plane, and that's yours. The entire flight deck comes alive with activity. The captain enters the bridge. 2 nuclear reactors begin to produce enough energy to accelerate 90,000 tons of sovereign U.S. territory to 30 knots, to provide enough induced headwind to hurl your plane into the sky. You light up your engines, push the throttles forward. You feel that aircraft crouching and straining against the catapult launch mechanism. The motors are roaring, and you feel the acceleration and sensation of your heart rate. Your senses are sharpening. Let's get it done. It's all up to you now. Your skills, your experience, your ability to integrate into an incredibly complex team of people and machinery. And for me, on many such flights of the controls of a Hawkeye, it was a heady moment to be in the presence of that much power and to be part of something so much larger than myself. So here's the connection I hope to make for you tonight. Students, this entire university is very much like that aircraft carrier. At dawn each day, Schreiner University steers into the wind to help launch you into a life of achievement. There's a crew of professors, provost, president, coaches, custodians, a community of Kerrville, wealthy donors, and minimum wage dishwashers, all who sense the gravity of what's before you. And they are lining up to assist you. And students, you are very much like that naval aircraft, coming to full power, straining against the catapult, poised to launch you impressively into the world awaiting you on the horizon. So let me encourage this distinguished audience. Whatever your age or position in this world, seize the cockpit controls of your life. Kick your career into afterburn. Even if you're not entirely sure of the destination, let me tell you what, it's much easier to maneuver when you have forward airspeed. That must be my signal. I'm not a ton. You see, living a life of consequence, or putting another way, leading with achievement requires a great deal from you. This university is an on-ramp, a catapult, but ultimately the flight path belongs to you. Whatever path you take, if you want to achieve your dreams, and the journey is going to require much of you. I pray you will accept the hope that Schreiner University offers, and I challenge you to find your calling. Don't find a career, find a calling, and pursue achievement with the courage and scholarship required to do great things. I'm confident that you will. Thank you for the honor and privilege of speaking this evening. May God bless you and Schreiner University.